Okay, so let's start. I think it's 10:05. So let's begin.
Yes.
And I see 45 number. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something that all of us know about, but perhaps don't give it too much thought. And sometimes we use some of these terms and concepts as part of our understanding of the work that we do. Sometimes we use these terminologies to explain something that we believe we have understood or we have not understood. But let's just talk about what we mean by generation. So, why we refer to a generation in our daily lives sometimes? It's like if you have a conversation with somebody and you land up figuring that your ideas and concepts are very similar. You have a comfort. You feel that the person gets you, right? That's one kind of conversation. And then there's another kind of conversation which could be something that where you almost don't understand each other. You don't understand the logic of the other person, and you don't know what they're saying, and they don't get what you're saying. And depending upon your personalities, there could be a conflict, or there could be no connection at all, or no bonding at all, because you don't get each other's concepts. And many a times we try to put logic to this, and we say, "Oh, it's a generation gap." So many a times, some very young people or some people much older than us don't get us, don't understand us, and or we don't understand them, and we say it's a generation gap, and we sort of leave it at that. But what is it that causes these generations to think differently? What is the background? What is it that they grew up in? What is it that they grew up with? And therefore, why is it right for them what they think? And why is it wrong for some other generation because of the way they think or their backgrounds or their upbringings? And I thought as designers, it's extremely important for us to try and understand what makes a generation. And of course, generation is not the only thing about the person and only defining thing about the person. There are many other factors, and which, as I've just learned, some of us have been researching even today. I think they are not in the meeting, but so there are many other factors that need to be studied when we look at any problem that we are solving or any challenge that we are solving. Um, but it's always good to know the backstories. It's always good to know the background. And if you do that, there is a better chance of empathy and there's a better chance of getting an aligned solution, right? And there's a better chance of us being good social human beings if we understand what goes behind a person's logic or concept or understanding or belief. So this is really what I thought I'll talk about today. And we very loosely use terms like millennials and Gen Z and so on. But I thought let's go a little deeper and see what other generations have been there and what generations are going to come up, because I think we need to be very, very mindful of this. This sometimes basis is the basis for our entire solution and could prove to be extremely, extremely successful if we understand people that we are designing for. Um, so let's sort of get in, and I think, of course, in the formal research language, it's called understanding the demographics and psychographics and so on. But simply put, I'm just saying let's know people that we design for. As simple as that. Uh, and many a times we only know about these two or three generations: millennials, Gen Z, or some of us know baby boomers is a terminology that we might have heard of, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But let's go back a little, go back in time and see when was the first time that actually a generation was defined very clearly. So there's no exact date. But interestingly, one generation called the greatest generation was defined by a news anchor who actually was an anchor and journalist called Tom Brokaw. And he was born in 1940, and he eventually even wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. But he started using this term during his anchoring and journalism much earlier on. And that sort of took people to try and understand and dig deeper. Some people literally conducted research on this terminology There was a very diverse study done talking to many of these people, doing qualitative conversations and understanding their background and so on. And that's probably the time that formally people started looking at what is the difference between generations, why should we know that difference, and how is that used commercially. Yeah, it all does boil down to commerce, but all the same, there is still an understanding in terms of psychology and social fabric, economy, and so on. So the first generation that is talked about was not actually, well, there's a generation even before the greatest generation. I'll come to what is the greatest one. But the first one that I will talk about was interestingly called the lost generation. Now, anybody knows why this would be? Why? Don't Google, please. I've spent a long amount of time in researching this, so I can tell you about it. But if anybody knows at the top of mind why a generation is being called the lost generation, is there anyone who has wants to take a guess? This is a generation that was born between 1880 to 1900. Yeah. So, yeah, anyone?
I think this is the during the war,
War time. Yeah.
World War. Yeah.
Very close. Yes, yes, almost. Yes. So there are a
It was
couple of
before war.
reasons. Sorry,
It was before the war.
it was
Pre-war, pre-war.
pre-war. Yeah. So people were born pre-war. You're absolutely right, Partho. And this is a generation that lived through the World War One. Can you go mute? Whoever is on not on mute. Yeah. So this generation lived through the World War One that happened in 1914, which means on an average these people were from teenage to the age of 25. So it sort of lived through that. Many soldiers came from this generation. The number of soldiers that were deployed in World War One is mind-boggling. It was 70 million soldiers, and out of that, 60 million were Europeans. And what happened post World War is that this whole generation that grew up with a certain set of values, because of the World War, many dynamics changed, and they suddenly started feeling that the values that they grew up with were no longer relevant after the war. So they almost felt lost. That's one of the reasons that it's called lost generation. This is also the generation that started discovering or looking for meaning of life because they had seen so much death. They had seen so much destruction, so much trauma, so much migration, so much loss of all kinds of jobs and family and so on. That they were the ones who started seeking meaning of life. And many intellectuals moved from US to Europe in search of meaning of life, and a sort of new generation that was seeking something that was lost was born. Of course, many died during the war and the Spanish flu from this generation, or saw a lot of death. That is also one of the reasons why it's called the lost, because many people lost their lives. Now, interestingly, this is not so true for India. We were a little away from this. So we've not always been parallel to what happened in the world pre-internet. Post-internet world has sort of aligned itself, and trends are more or less the same, and mega trends are more or less the same. Give or take a couple of years or 5 years, but not bigger than that. But from our times, I mean, from our country, our first prime minister was born in this generation, who obviously can't be called a lost generation because he actually led the country, and whatever the critics might say after 50, 70, 80 years, but Jawaharlal Nehru was born in this time, and he became the leader in this time, and Mahatma Gandhi was born in this time. No, actually, Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar, and so this is not too parallel for India, but all the same, nobody from this generation is alive. So it is unlikely that we will actually be solving problems for this generation. But it's just a good to know backstory or mega thought about this generation. Uh, by the way, even in India, there was a repercussion of the war, and about 1 million soldiers fought the war for the British Army. And that's also a huge wave that happened in India when they came back or they didn't come back. So about 75,000 to a lakh soldiers are supposed to have died from India. India actually had nothing to do with the World War except that we were being ruled by the Britishers. So it was a strange time. It was also a time when people used to people were reading, people started getting conscious of trends and fashions and so on. And then it all got lost. So that's just this generation called the lost generation. If anyone has anything to add on this generation or any thoughts, I'm happy to take it now. Anybody wants to? Partho, since you knew about the generation. Sorry, there is one more hand raised. Durga, yes?
So when I was doing graduation in philosophy, we had actually studied about this time, Ashwini,
Mm-hmm.
and the concept of existentialism about how life is absurd came
Mm-hmm.
during this time because, like you said, that people wanted to know the meaning of life, and we were
Mm-hmm.
this whole concept of you know life in a group where
Mm-hmm.
people fought in groups during the war, and how a single life has a meaning, like an individual has a meaning. So the individuality concept came from this generation. So this is what during this time existentialism, mainly many authors
Wow.
started writing different novels on individuality. Most of them were, I think, French. I think Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone
Yes.
de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus were three of them that I learnt about. So
Okay.
yeah, this is of that generation. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I can
Nidhi, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on what Durga was saying. Also, I started watching Peaky Blinders recently,
Okay.
and it's set in this era.
Ah.
And there's a lot of talk about how because of the war, and because of the essentially the capitalist industrialist growth that was happening as well at that point, like
Mm-hmm.
I said, there was a lot of question of class. There was a lot of question of loss.
Yeah.
And also, interestingly enough, one of the things they keep saying there was he never came back from the war. Even if you came back, you never came back.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That was also quite interesting. Yeah.
Uh,
If I may add,
some can I say, yeah. See
Yes,
the
Partho.
women. What do you call? Uh, I don't say the beginning of women liberalization. Started in this phase. If you see the picture, na, the girl is driving the car. है ना? So that whole thing of because of the war, the men went away. So all this,
Yes.
that was the beginning of the women
It was the
movement.
beginning. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, it took a much bigger shape during
Yes.
the Second World War.
Mm.
But you're right. This was the beginning. Actually, this was a time when women took these roles on, but they
Mm.
didn't actually actively fight the war or do anything at the war. But I think the next generation, they actually did that too.
Yeah.
So you're right. This is the beginning of sort of opening
And I
out.
think there was another thing which started very strongly is the what do you call belief in reason. Before that it was belief in like like the world life and the world was controlled by some like God kind of thing.
Hmm.
But from this
Yeah.
era, people started questioning so strongly, and the whole um, belief in reason started. The basis of science,
Hmm.
started
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
here.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
that you can
Hmm.
actually reason
Hmm.
up things. So there was this great European movement, especially in
Hmm.
Germany and France.
Hmm.
The basis of communism,
Hmm. Hmm.
that you're so all these things whose effect we see later on, they all seeded
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
time. Flower
Yeah.
child, all these things were during this time. Yes.
Flower
It was
Child is a
also
little later, but yeah.
But that
yeah,
thought,
60s,
that war,
90s.
how the war is.
That war shakes up things was
Yes.
really the thing. I mean, war did shake up things, and people started, like exactly you said, it's the beginning. Yeah, someone else was speaking. Jerry? Yes, Jerry.
Uh, so this is the era when the first notes of jazz were kind of heard in the late 19th
Mm-hmm.
century and the earlier 20th century, around 1910. started in New Orleans because it was a port city, and people from all over the world basically. So it was like a melting pot of like a soup of music that kind of was kind of birthed there, and it actually got influences from Africa, from Europe, because people from all over the world came there, and even it carried on during the wartime because of the influx of soldiers from different countries that when America decided to join the war later. So it actually
Right.
created the music that we call jazz today. So it originated during that period. So the
That is
outfits
so
that
cool.
these people wear also is something that you would associate with
Yes.
a formal jazz music. So they used to go to bars and clubs
Yes.
and things like that just to dance and to listen to this kind of music. Yeah.
Yes. That- Yeah, interesting. So though it's called the lost generation, so many things were seeded during this time. And I will, is there anybody else? I'll move to the next one now.
I'm just
So the
saying
next,
that it's a lost generation just because many people die also.
many
Because
people
there
died.
was
Yes.
no men,
Yes.
as mentioned, part two, there was no
Yes.
men to carry on
Yes.
the work, so also women had to
Yes.
work.
Yes. The war and the Spanish flu. So from
Yes,
this generation, many people lost lives. Yeah. So the next one, Partho, what you started speaking about, I think that reflected very largely in the next one, and it is called the greatest generation. And the reason being that they lived through, well, this is the generation that is born between 1900 and 1927. And well, this generation lived through the Great Depression, which was followed by the war. And again, there's the World War II, the freedom struggle. And if we come closer to India, this was also the time, of course, of freedom struggle, the Bengal famine, the massacres that were happening in India, uh, the religious riots that happened eventually. This generation has sort of seen it all or been at the center of many of these things. And of course, in India, many of them again fought the World War II. In fact, much more than the World War One. I think some 2.5 million soldiers fought the World War II. 1 lakh died. 1 lakh soldiers died, and it seems 2.5 lakh other people died due to World War II for various reasons. So this is a huge, huge impact on many people, families, regions, communities, and so on. This is also the generation that was the youngest during the Spanish flu epidemic. And the numbers are completely mind-boggling. I don't think we talked about Spanish flu till COVID happened, but we still probably don't know the numbers. One crore 20 lakh people died during the Spanish flu, or what was in India called Bombay influenza. 1 crore, over 1 crore people died. Not to say that COVID is any less lethal, but in COVID in India, 4.5 lakh people have died. And still, you can see the waves and the repercussions that each one of us has faced. Each one of us has lost somebody or seen somebody go through something or suffer, right? And that's just 4.5 lakh, and our population is much more than what it was during the Spanish flu. And at that time, you can imagine it's supposed to have taken away a large percentage of people out. And that's something that really had a great impact on our country as well, our people as well. And what it did really is it made that generation resilient because they actually had gone through the worst that anybody could ever imagine or not even imagine. And they became prudent because everything became very precious. And they also learned, and especially in India, Indian greatest generation, what it did, they also learned the humility concept that nothing lasts forever. We need to be conscious of what we have. We need to be grateful, and we need to face whatever comes our way. That kind of attitude was built in this generation. And of course, the picture that you're seeing is very much representative of the time that women actually got into professions or vocations or work. And that's also again a coming of age of the whole concept of women working itself. And that happened probably first in the West, and we saw that happening slowly in India, not during this time much, but at least women working was an accepted concept even in India at that time. So that's the greatest generation. My grandparents are from this generation. My grandmother worked all her life. She was a teacher and she was a headmistress of a school. And though it was very uncommon in those days, it was still accepted. It was not something that was unheard of in that generation. If somebody wanted to do something, it was a possibility for women to study, to graduate, to go to college. This is the first generation in India that saw it as a possibility. So a lot happened in this generation for us, especially for India. And I don't know, there are not many personalities I could think of because I kept thinking of my grandparents. But a lot of social fabric changed at that time, and Raj Kapoor is from this generation. He made these very socialist kind of movies in the early days. And yeah, many other people, of course, you could look up who was born and who is the greatest generation. But this was a very, very interesting generation too, because a lot changed during this time and a lot happened in terms of trauma and suffering and loss. Unimaginable. So that was this generation. Anybody wants to add something?
I think for India, this is a very significant generation because they were the young people when India got independence.
Yes.
So that's big change with lot of hope, and we want to do something fantastic, and this all this energy and so many. It was complete reversal, and so there is a freedom struggle or whatever we can call it that time, and then which leads to this whole Raj Kapoor film and the whole generation of film. If you see them, they are very this hope. There are a lot
optimistic,
of hope,
yeah, very
optimistic hope,
yes.
and this socialist fabric, which
Yes.
because of the political thing. So it was a very which defined India for next possibly 70 years. What happened in the people's mind at that point of time.
So this is also the generation that saw the end of various small kingdoms that existed in India, and therefore the social fabric that we speak about became the most interesting part because everybody suddenly felt that they are not subjects, they are citizens, and this is the first time that they were feeling that. So that also, of course, changed everything about how people thought about themselves and their communities and their cities, languages, states, everything.
Yeah.
Anyone wants to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to add.
Yes, Didi.
When COVID started, my grandmother, then 94, she was not fazed by it at all. We were all so worried about what has to happen and how she'll protect herself and all of that. And she was just not fazed by it. She said, I've seen so many wars and so many diseases. She said, these things happen. We just keep going on, and you live your life. You live through it. And the other thing is, I remember this is one of my favorite stories. My grandparents got engaged on Independence Day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And my grandmother keeps looking back at that and in such a favorable light. And she just talks about how in Bombay, they were in Bombay, and about how the entire city was celebrating together. And she felt like they were celebrating for her because it was her engagement day and the city was all, decked up and all of that. But they keep talking about how communities would live together and celebrate together. And it was because of that struggle that they'd all gone through together. So I mean, her vision of that day is quite beautiful. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's quite a story.
The funny part of that story is they went for a carriage ride, and my grandmother, who's Goan, had worn a sari for the first time because she was engaged to a Malayali man, and she didn't know how to wear a sari, and halfway through the carriage ride, the sari came off. But yeah, she went on a carriage ride in Bombay City on Independence Day.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is really a story worth writing a story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is probably the beginning of cool. So no wonder it's interesting that it's a greatest generation in America and in Europe and even for us in India. I think so many things happened and so much change happened actually. So that was the one generation that some of us have had anything to do with. Some of you have never seen anybody from this generation, but it's still considered the greatest generation. Again, in the words of this news anchor who talked about this generation as the greatest. And the next one, most of us would have had something to do with, was called the silent generation. So my parents actually would be from this generation, who were just born after the greatest generation. And because they had seen what happened during all those times and the uncertainty and the volatility and so on, and this is specifically for the West because they had seen it all happen in the world wars and the Spanish flus and so on, lesser children were born. Interestingly, in the world at that time, in Europe especially, the number of children born was much smaller. And because they had seen so much of this instability and war and trauma and so on, the parents brought their children up in a very different way. Because the parents had seen misery. So the children were brought up to encounter the least conflict possible. The children were taught not to have conflict in their life, to respect authority, to get a job for life. So that's the kind of generation that was that grew up at that time. So they are considered the most played safe kind of generation, hardworking, disciplined, conformists. Yeah, if they get one job, they'll stick to it for life and so on. And even if they are not in the conformist kind of profession or job, they would be the least conflict people. They would want to see world in harmony. They would want to see world as it should be. And to make the world that way, they would limit themselves to not doing conflict themselves. They would not actively do anything beyond that, but they would not raise a conflict. And that's the kind of generation that was built due to the parents' generation that had seen some misery. And some interesting examples from this generation. Of course, my parents are, I think, from this generation, but some interesting examples are Dalai Lama, or if you are in music, John Lennon. Uh, and if you see the kind of words and music that came from that time, it's all about, let's make the world a better place. Imagine if we were all one, and so on and so forth. By the way, Biden is also from this generation, which is kind of strange because he's really old to be the president, but he is from this generation as well. And this is a generation that is around us right now. We see them. They are the people who would be the grandfathers and so on around right now if you have them at home or if you have them in your extended circle. That's the generation really. And they are supposed to have contributed the least to any world conflicts. That's their thing. And that's why the silent generation. They would not do protests, they would not march. I mean, they would, of course, there are exceptions. And again, exceptions happen because of the background. So in India, this may not be so true, but this is largely a global, like I said, all these generations were defined strongly and were very different for different regions and countries and communities pre-internet. Post-internet, things are getting slowly aligned and there's hardly any difference. But yeah, that's that generation. Anyone wants to add anything? This is too real, right?
Ashwini, I don't know whether it's. I just read about this generation beings. So while every generation has a purpose, and this generation also, I think, was more in terms of a very foundational kind of a generation, for the future generations to base on. So they could not take risks simply because survival was critical. At the same time, laying a foundation for the future generations to come was a primary objective, maybe. And that is why they were silent, but maybe purpose-driven silence rather than just silence for the heck of it, maybe. I'm not sure whether that's true, but that's what I heard about this generation.
So, yeah, I mean, of course, it's going to be varying across countries and communities. But I think this generation was silent because they were taught not to question authority. Because
Right.
it's just good to be in line. It's not good to be out of line. It's almost that. So, of course, there must be exceptions and there must be great literature and music that happened during this time. But that's largely, you're right. It's not because they didn't want to. It was because they thought purposefully it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe foundational for next generations too. Anyways,
To probably take to be non-conformist, maybe, or to take more
yes,
risks rather than
yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And we really have to see what happens to the generation that's growing up right now.
Right.
Because who knows? Because they have been through so much uncertainty and volatility, uh, people losing jobs, lives, etc. We have to really see how this generation changes. The Gen Z that is right now young, will they be a big change or shift from now on? We just have to still see. But
Right.
it could be that, they'll get into a confirmation as well. Who knows? Yeah. Anyone else wants to add something?
Yeah, Ashwini, I have
Yes,
heard
Yoga.
about this generation, and you just mentioned that what this generation is facing right now. I just heard that there might be a possibility where this silent generation will repeat.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we don't
So,
know.
yeah, I don't know whether the generation cycle repeats after certain amount of years, but what do you think? Does it
Yes,
or
that's very interesting because we'll reach. I'm just going to reach a next generation, and they are
okay?
supposed to have an echo.
Hmm.
So the next one that I'm going to talk about is predictably. It's called. I mean, all of you would know this term for sure. Most of you called baby boomers, and there is supposed to be an echo boomer, which is now.
Hmm.
So the echo of that generation is kind of happening now. But yeah, we'll come to that. But yeah, interesting. Some things surely must be repeating because, well, many things repeat in life and there are cycles and things we actually literally can plot the graph of things repeating. They say, right? History repeats itself. I don't know for what reason.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, for some reason, Ashwini, I think this generation had larger families. Like if you see, even my grandparents, they had probably 9 or 10 children, which was considered an average at that point of time. And they had adopted a kind of do-it-yourself attitude. So, everyone was allocated tasks. Everyone had a specific position in the house. Everyone had a specific thing to do, which I think made them into those kind of people, you know, hardworking, disciplined, and
Hardworking.
things
Yes.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is interesting because you sort of don't rely on any external forces. You just try and do it within your own resources.
So during this time, I think at least Indian context, it was a lot of agricultural. It was completely agricultural improvement, that kind of thing. People, and so that's why you need large families, and there was scarcity because the last generation, India has just got uh, independence, so there is nothing much of anything, you know. So this self-reliance and large families was very important because how do you support your agricultural you know economy? Uh,
So some traits
yes.
actually do align for us, but some don't at all, right? The smaller number of children is a trait that didn't happen in India at all. It's very different. Yeah, Elodie, you were saying something?
I'm just saying, on India side, I don't know, but in Europe side, it's also to rebuild all the country. There was a lack of men a lot, so they did a lot of child, and there was no pill at that time, which was an important fact also for the women to not be able to be pregnant. So I mean, it's not like something that you were choosing always. It's what
right. Okay. Yeah. That too could be that there were less men and therefore less
I
next
think my
generation.
grandma would have avoided to get six child if she could have.
Okay. So we will move to the next one, which typically has this picture the moment you Google for baby boomers. But actually, it's a very different scene, and I'll just talk a little bit about this generation. It's been the generation of most interest for marketeers, even in India, because this is actually the age group from which a conscious marketing using profiles and generation understanding started. So it's not like they are probably the greatest uh, consumers or something. They could be. But the reason why this generation is a lot in focus or has been a lot in focus is because this is the first time that marketeers actually understood the concept of profiling people that they were marketing to. And that's why this has come in focus a lot repeatedly. So this is a post-war born generation, born between 45 and 65. And they were, well, they saw the television happening in the West, of course, much earlier than India. But yes, they saw the television coming in. So from radio to television, migration happened during this, for this generation. Consumerism began because television became a tool of mass marketing. And that kind of gave rise to consumerism. Of course, industrialization was happening in parallel to be able to support the consumerism or the other way around. And this is the generation that wanted to get into counterculture. They wanted to question. And because their parents' generation had worked diligently and sincerely and had made a tidy amount of money, they also saw a lot more affluence. This generation actually saw what could be an affluence. And they became the first sort of target consumers for anything that marketing was aiming at in the initial years of understanding what is generation, what is trend, how do you market to personas and so on. So this became like a very well-known, interesting topic of all the researchers, marketeers, sociologists, ethnographers, and so on, because they were alive and they could become the target audience, and you could literally see what was going on. You could see the effects of what you were doing, whether it's working, not working, and so on. There's some interesting personalities we have in India born in this time, and I think I'll invite you to sort of give your opinion on what you think, how they fit in here. So our Prime Minister is from this generation, Mr. Modi, and so is Amitabh Bachchan from the same generation. And I think so are our many ministers, finance minister, and so on, and heads of many institutions. And yeah, that's the claim to fame for this generation. And anyone wants to add something?
I think, see, this is Amitabh Bachchan means this angry young man kind of thing who is against the authority and want to fight and make everything
counterculture.
Right. Counterculture.
Yes.
And if you see before that was Rajesh Khanna and Dilip Kumar, that kind of generation who are harmonious, pacifist, romance. So they kind of, but I think in India this thing has come little late. This because our prosperity has not come during this time. This time we are really we had no affluence, no consumerism.
We were discovering what could be.
Yeah, means still we were. I think that I don't know. I don't know if you can call it the silent generation only. Some form was continuing for longer time because the scarcity was there. Means even our
Yeah, like Papa,
generation.
you and I grew up in this. I mean,
Yes,
I was born just after this. You were born within this time, I think. But
yes,
we grew up with scarcity and not so much of
yes,
affluence.
yes.
Yeah. And so did Modi and Amitabh Bachchan, right?
Yes.
I mean, they are the other end of other spectrum, right? We are the cusp, and they are
Correct.
actually right in the middle. But yeah,
In India, was there a bounce in the birth and everything? It was really visible.
bounce in the birth rate was not. No, okay, yeah. So the reason why you're right, the reason why they are called baby boomers is because there was a bounce in the baby rates, right?
Yes, yes.
That's
It
what
was the
happened.
same in India.
I don't know. I think in fact that's the time that India started realizing that the population is too much and there is a concept of birth control. So it was
Okay, okay.
quite the opposite in India probably. This is actually probably the first generation of children where the concept of having less children happened. So quite the opposite, interestingly.
Mm.
Anyone else wants to add something? This is, and this I feel is really not doing justice. This picture is not doing justice to the generation, but I couldn't resist putting it.
I think, sorry,
Please,
Ashwini, just
please.
wanted to add is that this generation, though they grew up with scarcity, they found pleasure in a lot of other things, like simple games like gilli danda, marbles. I think all, I think the community, being together as a community, enjoying together with friends, because there was no internet, so you had to
Yeah.
kind of socialize with the people around you. Used to be in and out of each other's houses.
Yeah.
You didn't think twice before having a meal at somebody's house, and you're just dropping in. So it was a very free kind of social interaction that happened. Unlike now where you have to phone up somebody and make an appointment and go over and
You have to
things
first
like
send
that.
a message to phone up someone and
Yeah.
then make a call and then yeah. Yeah. So this was a much
Yeah.
freer time. I also remember the times and I guess this generation grew up with that. And I will, yeah, Partho.
Yeah. See, this is also the time when the migration started from village to town, or the
Urbanization.
cities. Urbanization started, and also the value of education. That with education and right kind of things, if you do, a chaiwala can become a prime minister. So that one
That
Robert,
optimism and hope
yes,
happened.
yes, and it suddenly become possible to become a big time industrialist with nothing.
You could become anybody.
You
Yeah.
can't become anybody, and so because otherwise there was this compartment of fabrics, like the rich man and the poor farmer and
Hmm.
all the caste system, they all just broke away.
They started dissolving at this time. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So I think for India, it worked in a very different manner.
So it
Maybe
was
it is.
yeah, it's a generation that was born post independence. So that
Yes,
worry was not there at all. So
yes.
there was time and space to think of other ways of progress.
And education, I think that time the education becomes is like prominent thing, and because of the education, people start challenging the old thoughts.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Means in if you see in India, uh, what do you call movement of people's culture, this is very defining time. This is
Hmm.
where the
Hmm.
shift happening, big shift,
Hmm. Hmm.
from old to new. This is the
Hmm.
new India, beginning of the new India.
Yeah. I mean, literally, because post
Yeah.
independence. Yeah.
Yes. Post, and it is little, it's maybe 10-20 years after independence. Because by the
Yeah.
time they grow up and they get responsibility to do something, it is,
It was many years since.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I will move on to the next one. So this is the generation born between 65 to 80. And I personally identify more with this generation than the other one. Uh, this is interestingly called a latchkey generation in the world, which means this is the first generation where women working became so common and more in the West that children came back to empty homes with a key. And yeah, interestingly, I personally did too. So this is a generation that became far more individualistic, and this whole thought of I could be leading, I could be a leader. And leader doesn't necessarily mean you become a political leader or something, but in everyday things you could actually lead, was a concept that happened in this generation. Also because lesser number of children, better income, more working parents, more educated parents, more attention to bringing up a child happened in this generation. So this individualism was probably because parents gave a lot more focus on bringing up a child. Child psychology was a term that sort of started getting spoken about. This is also the generation that at work, because everybody worked in this generation, especially in the West, and also rising in the East and India and as well. That focus was execution, like getting things done. This generation wanted to get things done. It was almost like they were in a hurry. You know, they wanted to get things done. They had a reason, they had a purpose. This whole thing of corporate ladder climbing happened during this for this generation, literally. That you have to achieve, you have to be, you know, overtly doing things so that you achieve. A promotion is important, and so on. This is not a generation necessarily that thought about social impact. And yeah, I mean, guilty of that. Environment, ecology, sustainability, diversity, inclusion, these words were not there when this generation was growing up. They were not so much in focus. I mean, of course, there were exceptions, but these were not the priorities. The priorities were uh, financial success, fame, and so on. And this is also interestingly the generation that learned the concept of empathy. And it is said that it is because there were lesser children and therefore there was less insecurity, that one could look outside oneself, that there was no fear of not getting enough for myself. And therefore, I mean, it's said that you can do social work only on a full stomach. And that literally happened for this generation, that it could think of the world only because it didn't have that degree of insecurity within themselves. So that's the generation X, and all actors and the storyline of Friends. That's like a huge phenomenon globally, is representative of this generation. Individual, with empathy, individual goals, individual purposes, uh, desire to succeed in what they do, desire to have a conventional success parameter, is something that happened to this generation. Interesting examples from India I picked up for this generation: Shah Rukh Khan, Sachin Tendulkar, Madhuri Dixit, Arnab Goswami, Arvind Kejriwal. So many interesting personalities. Each one has some facet or the other of what this generation is defined as. And yeah, this of course seems, many of the things for this generation seem to align very closely with how I am and how I grew up, or how my friends are and how they grew up. So this is something that I fairly closely identify with. Anyone wants to add something to the Generation X? Nobody? Too close for comfort? We all know this generation too well, so we don't want to speak about it.
Everything has been said, I think.
Partho?
You don't know what to speak. Like there's just so much.
It's too real, right? And it's too
Too
around
real.
us.
Yes, too real.
Yeah. So yeah, this is where things start getting very real and sometimes uncomfortable. So I'll move to the next one.
I just want to say one thing.
Yes.
One thing that I feel happens is there's a cause and effect. There's always a reaction. The new generation is always reacting to the previous generation and reacting to their times. And if we have to see what Generation X did, which is every leader and purpose driven and the idea of empathy, I'm just wondering if that's what's going to happen now, because we're going to have a couple of, this is now with Gen Z, we're a couple of generations later, we're looking at possibly similar factors. There is also, I think with Generation X, there was also an awareness that was starting to build about environmental issues and like you said, not living for yourself but living for others. So I'm wondering if you'll see a similar trajectory with the Gen Z.
To be seen.
Yeah.
We'll see it. I mean, I'm sure we'll see it. But then there is the other generation that is much talked about and is actually the largest workforce right now around the world. Almost every country is what we call millennials. They are actually Generation Y, but they are popularly known as the millennials. And the reason, well, they are born from the 1980s to mid 90s, 95, 96. And the reason they are called millennials is because most of them became decision makers at the turn of the century. So they are not I mean, the misconception for many would be that millennials are the people born in 2000 or in this century, but that's not so. The commercial definition is that they got their own wallet or their own financial decision making in the millennium. I mean, at the turn of the century. So that's the thing. This is the first generation that has been brought up with internet being around. This is also supposedly around the world the most scheduled born children, which means their parents have consciously decided when exactly their child would be born, including the year, date, the journey in their own professional lives, their own personal lives, and so on. So this is also a generation that has seen the warfare of terror, seen the warfare of or the experience of global warming. They're literally the ones who have experienced what has gone wrong. So the generation before that probably did not experience it so acutely and therefore had no reason to worry or do anything about it. But this is a generation that has literally started facing all these issues. Uh, for them, social media is the media. I mean, there's no distinction between anything. There's no reason to go beyond social media for anything for this generation. This is also the generation which, like, because they were the most scheduled children, they were born in economically better conditions around the world, whether it's India or any other part of the world, especially, of course, the West, but even in India and other developing countries. And therefore, uh, they don't need jobs to survive. And we are, of course, talking about more or less the trend setting or the leading samples, right? I mean, this is what happens in the large sample and then the rest follow. So many jobs, no necessity of a single career throughout their life. This is the first generation that would openly feel so and admit so. This is also the generation that has respect for environment, ecology, sustainability, diversity in people, all of that. And this is currently the most significant workforce in most parts of the world. They are the most significant buyers. They are the most significant people with social opinion makers, uh, conscious of how they live, conscious of effects of what they do, how they buy, how they live, acutely aware of what technology can do and cannot do. Uh, this is also the generation where the parents decided that having a child is an investment and therefore fewer children. So invest more on fewer. That's really how this generation was brought up. This is also the generation that has tried extending becoming adulthood as much as possible. They don't want to become adults soon. In fact, they are still there. This generation, there are still many of them who have refused to accept that they are adults and completely on their own now, and so on. In the US, this is the most diverse generation also. So there are 90 million millennials in US, and those 90 million are the most diverse because of various factors like migration, second generation, jobs, and so on. And this is also the generation that has the most influencers on social media. So this generation is literally far more than what we give them credit for. They are literally ruling the world and forming opinions. Mark Zuckerberg is from this generation. So yeah, so much for millennials. Anyone knows any influencers from this generation and how they're changing anything? Happy to hear.
I didn't want to talk about influencers, but I was surprised talking to students that they are not, they are completely in a different way, as we described before, of the ex-millennial. Now they don't care about, it's like almost a reaction to their parents. And they don't want to work so hard to achieve the same thing, and they just can have a good plan of career, quite short, and just finish and take their retirement. I don't know, at 50 and with good money, they are okay with it. It's a completely different mindset.
Yeah.
We have been trained, yes, to work so hard so that because very job are there, very few job is there. And this is completely opposite to, depending on the market is still the same, but there is few jobs still, but now they decide to, okay, I don't want to spend more effort. I just do my job, enjoy my job, do what I'm doing, and then I just want to finish it up. So it's completely a different way to think, yes. So again, it's a reaction, I guess, like Nidhi was saying, against the previous generation. True. Like, I don't want to spend so many hours in my job when I could enjoy and have my hobbies.
So in a research about you exactly said this about spending time, but in a research it came up in one of the top 3 factors that millennials want to have lots of free time to themselves.
Yes.
It's one of their top 3 priorities. Now what they will do with that time to themselves is basically probably spend it on browsing and so on. But they want to have that time to themselves, and that's one of their top 3 priorities.
Yes, when we have been told actually that if you have no money, you cannot have free time in a way. And for them, it's a way to, no, but it's true. To enjoy and have hobbies, you need to get some money. It's what we have been told to. And now they think differently.
Yes, it's exactly the opposite. So we were also told that you got to work hard so that you will have money, so that you will enjoy life in the end. Whereas this generation wants to do exactly the opposite. So that's how it is. It's a reaction, and there's nothing right or wrong. It's just how it is.
But most of them, because they saw their parents working so hard and not achieving so much and having a life which is quite hard to not achieve so much at the end, or to not get so much pleasure in life, let's say.
Right. What's the point of working so hard? So that's that. Yeah. Yeah, and YOLO generation. Yes. Somebody was saying something. Didi, you were saying something?
It's a little confusing because technically, I'm part of the millennial generation, but I feel like the millennial generation in America and Europe is different from the millennial generation in India. In some aspects, in some aspects of it. I don't consider myself a YOLO generation. So I'm going to say that doesn't apply to all of us. But I did have
X1.
Sorry?
You are the X1, I think. We are the X1.
So in your mind, you are the X.
It depends if you take the birth date or the time where you get 20, it depends.
I think I'm in between, because I literally had a conversation with my dad this weekend where I told him that I still feel like I'm 20. So in my mind, I'm still 20.
That's great.
So I don't know if that means I don't want to become an adult, or if I'm just young and hard. I don't know what that means. But
this extending of becoming an adult is extremely common, and it's extremely evident in the way the investments happen or the financial decisions happen, in the way that people of this generation don't want to buy large assets. or
Yeah.
they are extending the age of marriage or age of children, or even age of getting a job or getting a steady job. So this extending becoming an adult is there. It's very evident.
Yeah, I also remember reading um this blog, this article
Mhm.
about how, people say that about millennials, that we don't want to become an adult yet.
Yeah.
And this article, this woman who wrote it, she was talking about how it's not that we don't want to, we can't. We can't afford to buy a house. We can't afford to buy a car. The economics of life was so different for our parents' generation that it is for ours. My parents could afford to buy a house or a car at a certain age on a salary that was possibly 50% of what I'm earning right now. But they could afford to buy a house and a car and have children and raise them and send them to schools. But this generation can't. I remember reading this article and resonating with it about how it's a little unfair to say that this generation is pushing adulthood by choice. Uh,
Okay.
Maybe not pushing adulthood by choice, but by consequence of
Yeah.
the current
Yeah.
situation. Yeah.
Yeah, Parthivi, I agree. Investing in experiences rather than assets. But that what Nidhi is saying is that it's not only by choice. It's also because you can't anyways invest in assets. So why not invest in experiences? And I don't know, I'm just listening from both sides. My son is in this generation, and I also listen this extending of adulthood stuff a lot. And you may be right. It's not like there is a choice being made. It's like there is no choice. So then what are the other choices? Make the most of those. So yeah, this is of most interest for the next few years for sure. And we really have to see what happens, because if this generation uh, denies taking stable jobs, then we are going to see a very different world. And yeah, so be it. So there is a little fun thing that I thought I'll share before I move on to the last two. I'm sorry I've extended my time a little, so whoever needs to leave can leave if there is a meeting at 11. Sorry about that, but I have few more interesting things. So this is just something that I thought we've discussed something seriously, but these are very evident things as well. Somebody had created this. So just read them.
I just want to say that we don't really have raves anymore.
It's a word not to be spoken about. I think many people identify with this, right?
Or would like it. Let's just say.
Yes. Okay, so that was a little fun, but there is the current generation that's still here and growing. which is the native digital generation called Gen Z, as it's popularly known, from 1997 to about 2012-14. So they are the native smartphoners. They have always had a smartphone. So they don't know the concept of finding things any other way, whether book or walking up to something or speaking to someone to find something. They don't have that concept because their phone has been all of that. They are far more adventurous because they feel everything is at in their hands, literally through the phone. So any help, support, anything at all that they need, they can just reach out anytime. So they don't feel this whole sense of being lost or insecure because they feel phone has all the answers. They're far more gender and social inclusive. Again, because less insecurities of being who they are, because it's more or less neutral. Everybody has the same thing. I don't have any less or more because I also have my smartphone at hand. Attention span is supposedly low, and therefore the world has sort of had to learn to communicate very differently, and that's what we literally see on social media in terms of whether it's a clickbait article or whether it's an advertisement or whatever it is. It focuses on this generation's attention span being low. So this is also the time that articles started putting 2 minutes reading time kind of notifications at the bottom so that you know how much time it's going to take, or 1 minute, yeah, 1 minute read. And this is also the generation that disrespects millennials. They believe that millennials are not adulting fast enough, and therefore this generation has had to remain kids. They have not managed to become adults soon enough when they could. I mean, they are adventurous and they don't have any fear of growing up. So that's that. The millennials and Gen Z clearly don't have much in common. Though outwardly they may seem very similar. They may look very similar, think few of the things very similarly. And the people who are not from these two generations may look at them and think they are the same, but they are very different. In their world, a brand or a person or a place or a job or a product need not be in the real world. It can be in the metaverse. It doesn't matter if a place or a job doesn't have a physical presence. They're completely okay with it because that's how they've grown up. That's how they've been brought up. That things are as real in the virtual world as they need to be. They don't need to be more real than that for them to believe in them. So it's a very different world to understand. I mean, yeah, it's hard to literally be in their shoes and see how they think or what they are thinking. But this is the generation that's going to be the leaders of tomorrow because millennials have more or less decided that they will not become those adults who will take responsibility. So this is the generation that will do that. I think Greta Thunberg is from this generation. And they are TikTokers, Instagrammers. They will be caught dead on Facebook. They will never go to Facebook. Uh, they will be on LinkedIn because they are serious about and they are adventurous about doing what they're going to be doing. Anyone wants to add something? Some Gen Z person in our team, please speak up.
I'm not Gen Z, Ashwini. I just wanted to add,
Yes.
actually something very interesting came up in one of the previous projects that I was working on. It was with an institute, an MBA institute. And you were talking about, Instagram and social media kind of relooking at the way they repurpose content for these guys. But even institutes today are looking at short capsules of information to hold their attention.
Yeah.
So it's across the board.
Courses and everything will have to literally change. That's true.
Yeah. Also, just, I mean, to kind of, it's a little confusing with this generation as well. I mean, if you look at investment trends and stuff, if you look at mutual funds, for example, a large part of this generation has actually started investing much earlier than millennials and their predecessors, basically.
Yeah.
So I just want to add, one of the defining factors of millennials and their attitudes towards finance is also because the millennials did see the financial crash of 2008 6 and 8, essentially when they started to enter the workforce, and a lot of people got set back by many, many years. Gen Z so far has been documented, and a lot of their behaviors have been documented pre-COVID.
Yeah,
Through
true.
COVID, there has been a lot of financial impact on Gen Z as well.
True.
So it'll be interesting to see how that change, if it changes their behavior and their attitude.
True. Yeah. There isn't enough work done post-COVID because nobody believes it's post-COVID yet. So, which is true also. It's not yet post. So, but I'm sure some work must be happening which we are not privy to. We'll have to see. And lastly, now there is the generation which is called Generation Alpha. And right now we don't think much of it, but it's again a very, very, very different generation. So this is a generation that has done schooling at home for last 2 years. So you can imagine how different this generation is growing up. They are digital masters. I mean, they know how to do it all because they were literally born with some device in their hands. They will be critical consumers as they grow up because for them, everything virtual and real, there is no boundary. It's the same. Virtual is real. They're extremely comfortable and native of the virtual world. So they don't distinguish at all. They will question everything. And they will also be the generation that will make out marketing from real because they've grown up doing that. So just the way some of our earlier generations could say that I see a person and I can read the person and understand if he's a good human being or not, they will see content and they will know if it's real or not because that's what they are native of. Uh, and the generation after them will be the COVID babies. And we don't know what they're going to be called yet. I don't think they've been named yet. At least I'm not aware of. But this is the generation to really learn from or learn about because this is going to be the largest generation going forward that if any of us are still going to be designing, then designing for. So in another few years, not just even 5 years or so, we will be designing for this generation. So it's extremely important to understand what their drivers are, what the mega trends are in the background, and how they will be behaving, making choices, and taking decisions. So for them, a friend or a chatbot is an equal comfort. It makes no difference. That's how they'll grow up. They'll be makers as well because they have access. So that's what we know at the moment about Generation Alpha. Maybe there's more to come. And again, if anybody wants to add something, please go ahead. We'll just take one or two comments and then we'll close the meeting. Sorry, I've extended it by almost 20 minutes.
We're already designing for the Ashwini. Reliance Confectionery is
Yes.
Gen Alpha.
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
Ashwini, I have a question.
Yes.
On what basis a generation changes, whether it is a defined period or who decides whether there is a need for a new generation to name, and whether it is dependent on any impact in the society or technology. What would you say on this?
So who decides is various people actually, but initially when the first few generations got decided, the period was about 15 to 20 years. And that was the sociologists and like in one case even a journalist was trying to define what a generation is. But today if you look at who's defining the generation is much more the marketing world. The marketing world needs to define very sharply who their audience is, what their drivers are, and so that they can go ahead and develop ideas, products, experiences for that generation and get reasonable success. So today a generation is being defined by the marketeers or the ethnographers that work for marketing. That's the way it is. And the number of years again changes from time to time. If there is a very large driver event happens like COVID, it will definitely start a new generation because that event itself has such a large impact. Everybody's decision making or mindset, beliefs, and so on. That even if the previous generation was just 5 years, post-COVID generation would be defined as the next one. So I think what happens as a driver is what's the defining factor.
Yeah. It's also the way technology is changing. I think the years are getting reduced for a generation to change.
True. So I guess this will be the longest generation now, and the post-COVID probably will be even shorter. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so this I
Okay.
guess is
Thanks.
recorded and will be uploaded, and you can access it if you want to, as in when. But yes, Gen Z Alpha doesn't know how to use a pen or pencil. Yes, but that is not going to hinder anything. So that's also the problem, right? We believe, how can you not write? But they believe, why do you need to write? So yeah, that's
Right.
an acceptance on both sides.
Actually, you're right. It's not about why do you need to write. They don't need to write. Where do they need to write?
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so I hope we looked into some things that we somehow neglected earlier, and I hope we use some of these thoughts or backstories or understandings in the way we design. So thank you. Have a great week. I think Jayshree